Good afternoon, everyone. It is noon, and so it's time to kick things off for our Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. My name is Ann Stout. I'm a Conservation Outreach Specialist with the Iowa Learning Farms program, guest hosting today in Dr. Matt Helmer's place. Super excited to welcome Rabin Bhattarai from the University of Illinois. He is with the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering there, where he's an associate professor, and he'll be leading us today in a discussion of cover crops and can cover crops provide targeted nutrient loss benefits into the future. So look forward to this really provocative talk here and thought-provoking. So just so everyone knows what to expect in the webinar ahead, I'll be turning the floor over to Dr. Bhattarai in just a moment. He will be giving us about a 25-minute presentation. During that time, if you have any questions, please type those into the chat box, and then I'll be relaying those at the end. We'll operate as a Q&A session so that the recording of the webinar has all of the Q&A and the discussion included in that as well. In the meantime, please keep your cameras off and microphones muted during the presentation portion, but feel free to submit any questions via the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rabin Bhattarai. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. So first, I would start with actually acknowledging the contribution of my former PhD student, Rishabh, who is now a postdoc at University of Florida, that he actually did most of part of this research as a part of his doctoral work under my supervision. So let's talk about actually like issue, right? We talk about cover crops and then how their outlook or their benefit, perceived water quality and soil health benefit, how that translates into the future. So first, I want to begin with actually bigger picture, why we even have to think about the cover crop, right? Okay. So I'm sure like most of you have heard about this issue of your hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, right? That's this large, big area which covers somewhere between your 4,000 to almost 8,000 square mile of this big Gulf area where dissolved oxygen level is so low that you cannot find any fish, any aquatic ecosystem is wholly destroyed. And that happens every summer, okay? So this is basically due to high nutrient rich water brought by Mississippi River to the Gulf, okay? And which is actually, this is the largest major hypoxic zone in the world, okay? So what that happens in this case, like you have high nutrient water is coming from Mississippi River, from our farmlands, okay, and that causes algal bloom here in your Gulf every summer, as you can see in this part here. And then what happens then? Well, that algae decomposes, that creates your low oxygen concentration in the water, and what actually does then, it damages the whole aquatic ecosystem. Okay, so from the past research, what we have found out actually is then most of the nitrogen and phosphorus, okay, that's ending up in Mississippi and going to the Gulf, which is creating all this problem, is basically originating from our your agricultural farmland in upper Mississippi River Basin, like state including Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, and others. Okay, and in terms of contribution from individual state, the state I'm from, Illinois, actually has kind of bad name in terms of reputation, because Illinois is one of the largest nitrogen and phosphorus contributing state in the Midwest because of our agricultural practice, our intensively drained field. We drain based on actual data set. Illinois contributes around like 18% of nitrogen and 13% of phosphorus to the Mississippi that ends up in the Gulf. So what things actually, again, like can complicate is going into the future is then, as we know, like we have more than 8 billion people in the world that we need to feed, right? And then population is going to increase. It's expected that in the next 25 years, by end of around 2050, we're expecting around like another 2.5 billion people in the world. So that means we have to grow more food within a finite land with a finite water. So that's a challenge. And then also, what other dynamics that can complicate our future is then this scenario of the climate change or global warming that we're talking about, which is basically due to increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is warming our Earth more than what we have done in the past. And depending on how your future looks like down 30, 40, 50 years, things can look pretty different. Okay. So let's look at then how then your cover crop can help, right? Okay, so basically we're talking about nutrient pollution from our agriculture practices, or especially in our water resources that goes from a tile field, our surface waters up in Mississippi and your Gulf, right? But then this is just one actual example. Like we have like more than 400 this kind of hypoxia around the world. Okay, so this is not the just issue with us; it's actually a global issue. Depending on somewhere your source of nutrient can be urban areas, somewhere source can be agricultural land. So, but then we have this global issue of the hypoxic zone, nutrient in water, algal bloom, and your uh, region with your low oxygen level is a global issue. Okay. So one thing that has been proposed and that research so that works great is actually planting a winter cover crop. Basically, what we do is that since in our region, because of our climate, our weather, what you will see is then winter is too cold to grow anything. So what we do, most of the time we practice one crop, right? Especially on this region, upper Midwest. So we either grow corn, soybean, or depending on wheat and sorghums. Okay. But then we have between your, let's say, end of October through, let's say, early March, even late March. So our fields are pretty much empty, right? There's nothing growing on. You have bare soil, sometimes even tilled in the fall. So that is like what that causes actually is then two issues. Like one is erosion. That means whenever it rains, that can pick up loose soil. And then also like whatever leftover nutrient is there in the soil profile can also flush with the water, right? Either with the runoff water or with your water draining into the tile system, okay? So how winter cover crop help in that is that it helps you to actually capture whatever leftover nutrient is there in the soil and recycle that one, right? Okay. So we put your cover crop seed, and then cover crop can be different shapes and sizes depending on your region, depending on your agricultural practices. Okay. So what it does, then you put the seed on the fall, and then once it reaches optimum biomass sometime in the spring, at the end of vegetative state, what we do is then the cover crop is either chemically decomposed or mechanically incorporated into the soil. And then what that does actually is then over the next few months, whatever nutrient is trapped by that cover crop will be released into the soil and will be available to the next cash crop. And if you do things right, that means like if we kill the cover crop in the right time, then we can have this additional benefit of actual nutrient recycling as well. Okay. And one of the go-to cover crop in our region actually is cereal rye, especially after corn. Okay, the cereal rye is one of the most used cover crop in this region due to its high tolerance to the low temperature condition, and is easily can come back again in the spring, right? Okay. So again, we know that based on the research, based on the data, experimental data, so we know that cover crop work, but then again, we have the cover crop adaptation very small. Like if you look at recent data set, actually, like I think this is the recent publication came last year, said cover crop adaptation was actually like around 7% in the whole region in the Midwest. And actually in the Illinois, it's actually even less than that, 5%, okay? But then the state has developed a nutrient loss reduction strategy, and that says actually is that if you want to get our nutrient reduction target, reducing 40% of nitrate from our water system, we need somewhere between 35 to 75% adaptation of cover crop in our croplands. Okay. And because of those benefit, knowing that cover crop works, we have actually the federal programs, we have a state program that helps actually for farmers or producers to grow cover crop in the winter to reduce the water quality impact and also improve the soil health, right? Because long-term impact of cover crop are not only reducing the nutrient loss, but also improving the soil quality and improving the soil health itself. Okay. And past study have shown actually is that having cover crop helps like in terms of cost recovery, right? I think one study that came a few years ago done by one of my good friend in Purdue, Salimar Armstrong, they said like, even if you don't have any like your cost offset from any program, cover crop self alone can recover around 60% of the cost from the benefit of your soil health benefit, nutrient loss benefit. And then when you add that with your, let's say, ECUP and CSP program benefit, then cover crop actually can recover actually almost 2 times the cost what it goes into the system. Okay, that based on the study. So now I have actually 3 stories to tell, short stories, okay? So then I wanted to, as I said, I want to look at actually then how does your cover crop practice impacts in long term, right? Okay, so it is, I would say like it's a relatively new practices in terms of research, because if you go back, probably producers have been doing this in the field for many years, but then the actual data set that we have in the from the research in research reports or peer-reviewed publications are very like sparse. Okay, like we don't have like somebody doing like 30 years of cover crop and finding out all the benefits. So we have like 5, 6, 7. I think most I've seen is 10 years of experimental data that shows how good cover crops can be for the different benefit. But then if you want to look at long-term impact, so what we do is that we actually try to replicate that system through the equations. Okay, and then we call that practice called modeling. So first thing we asked our group did was actually is then, can we simulate or can we replicate what's happening in the field using some models where we actually try to replicate your growth of the crop and on daily basis, looking at the water dynamics, looking at the nutrient dynamics, and then how that crop growth is affecting your nutrient dynamics. And then can we replicate that dynamics first to see before we even talk about long-term implication using this tool, okay? So first what we did was that I teamed up with a good friend of mine, as I said, Salimar, who is doing cover crop field study, not very far from where I am, just 1 hour west from here in Lexington, Illinois. He has been actually doing this cover crop field research for last 7, 8 years. And then what we did was then we took his data set, and then what we tried to first do was, and then is, can we replicate what he's seeing in the field through the models? Okay, so we use this tool called DSAT, which is actually it's a series of your crop models put together. It can actually simulate your 42 different crops, okay, including your corn, soybeans, sorghum, and all the other legumes, okay. But then what we have, and as you can see, like in terms of module, we have your input files, or you provide information on the weather, soil information, crop and field management, and then it has your all the systems, like it talks about soil module, plant module, and different things, and then it gives you then soil, water, nitrogen dynamics, and crop growth on a daily basis. That's an output. Okay. So first challenge for us actually to use the DSAT in this system was actually is that DSAT doesn't have actually the system, the cover crop that actually Salimar was using was cereal rye. It doesn't have a cereal rye model. So what we did was then we sat together, kind of put our brain together, then said, hey, it doesn't have cereal rye in the model, but then what is your, let's say, closest cousin to cereal rye in the system that we have? Okay, and then if we found out that actually then winter wheat is actually pretty close to cereal rye in terms of phenology and your crop variety, but then it has a little bit of different characteristic is than as your cereal rye is more winter hardy than this winter wheat. That means it can survive winter better. Okay, so then what we did was that based on the published research and then based on the agronomic knowledge that we have, based on the experiments, we kind of adjusted some of the parameters in the winter wheat module to actually replicate the growth of cereal rye in the system. Okay. So then these are the results. Okay, so first what we want to do is then, okay, how good our model does then. First, actually, even if you talk about model for long term, first we want to see actually whether the model is replicating the reality or not, right? What we have seen in the field experiment. Okay. So then we actually did was then, as you can see in this graph, okay, the red line, okay, those red dot line actually is, these are your simulated biomass, okay, by the model. And the green line are actually green dots you see on those chart, okay. So these green dots are actually the observed biomass in the field. Okay, so we try to, again, you can see the model can give you biomass on daily basis, where actually in the field, it's impossible to go and collect daily biomass from the field, but then we have actually 2 snapshots. One was actually before winter hit, and then other one is your before they terminated the cover crop. Okay, so you can see based on these 2 chart, like okay, the model did fairly well, I would say. Okay, and then next one actually was to look at actually is then whether the model can also okay replicate the other dynamics, your soil, water dynamics. Okay, wanted to see then, because these are your tile field, okay, where we have been monitoring, my collaborator have been monitoring daily tile flow, nitrate loss in the tile, and we wanted to see then how much the model was able to replicate the dynamics as well. Okay, so you can see these are the 2 lines. You can see the red line is your cumulative your tile drainage flow. Okay, the unit is actually in millimeter over that your 4 years, going from 14 to 18. And your green line are actually your red line are simulated versus green line are you observed. Okay, what they measure in the field. And you have in the different condition. There are actually we looked at two field. One is actually a field without cover crop, because they also use that as a comparison, right? How much cover crop we have the benefit in terms of reducing the tile water and the tile nitrate loss. So we had actually compared the model performance of both field. One is your field without cover crop and field with cover crop. So FCC is your actual field with cover crop, and FN your field without cover crop. And then you can see like both cases, like actually like you can see this was your top two graph are your tile drainage, and your bottom two graph are your nitrate losses. And model did fairly good job in terms of your replicating tile flow as well as tile nitrate loss. Okay, now that we know, we actually seen that model where what's applicable to replicate three dynamics, right? One is your what happened in the field, okay, in terms of biomass of the cover crop, and also what's happening with the tile flow and with the tile nitrate loss. And then we said, actually, if you can replicate your, let's say, 4-5 years pretty fairly well by the model, then what you wanted to talk about actually is then how about the model works in other years, like where, because the field experiment was done actually is then multiple field, okay? There were multiple treatments. So we wanted to see whether the model is able to replicate your other practices as well, okay? Like here is your SEC per se, SN, these are your field where SEC is your cover crop field where fertilizer was applied in the spring, and SN is your non-cover crop field where fertilizer was applied in the spring. Okay, in that case, also see the model did fairly well, good job. Okay, like in terms of a comparison. Okay, so here was actually kind of your model performance. You can see like your nitrate loss reduction during that 4-year period was like 48%. Observed versus 43% from the model. Tile drainage reduction was 30% observed versus 21% from the model. That was for the fall fertilizer between cover crop and non-cover crop field. And for spring applied fertilizer applied field, you can see again 47% 45 for the nitrate loss. And then tile nitrate reduction was 21 versus 19. So you actually can see like the model was did fairly well, right? And it was not only able to replicate what happened with the biomass, but also like your how much nitrate we can reduce from the tile waters using the cover crop. So then next, then let's move to the story 2 then. So we wanted to see then, based on our 5-6 years of data that we kind of train the model and then kind of made sure that model was able to replicate the reality. So our next thing was to do is then, okay, how about then we look at actually long-term impact? Like first was actually to say, let's say if we applied cover crop in the field for last 20 years, okay, how does the long-term impact of the field will make a difference in the field? So here we did the whole, then what we did was then, next was, if we apply cover crop in every potential tile field in Illinois. Okay, so this is the map of Illinois showing your agricultural land as well as your green line here. Green area, shaded area is actually your field with tiles in Illinois. Okay, so we see like your a lot of field here using the tile, and that is one of the reason we lose the water from our field with the nitrogen, right? Because tile water not only helps to grow crop and get better yield, but then also it can be like a detrimental environmental effect when you flush that soil nitrogen in the tile water. Okay. So then first thing we want to see actually is then how does the model does, let's say, like whether the model is able to replicate the reality, right? So this was what we did was then first, even without applying cover crop, we knew that in the past, like there were barely any cover crop adaptation in Illinois, right? As you said, recent data says 5%, but then we did actually like kind of 20 years past simulation, okay, going from 2001 to 2020. So we did actually is then this field, let's say if you don't have any cover crop applied, whether we can replicate your, let's say, average corn and soybean yield in our region or not. So you can see these are your data coming from USDA NAS for that average 20 years corn yield in our state for different counties versus what one model was giving us, and same thing for the soybean. So as you can see, like your results were pretty close actually in terms of how much yield we can we got actual from the field versus how much model was saying. Okay. So then next thing what we want to do is then like now if you apply, okay, now if you apply for a cover crop in our field, like what is the potential of how much biomass you can get in the different part of the state, okay? So in this case, what we did was then first we wanted to see the model is kind of replicating the past history. So then what if like we apply, let's say, cover crop in every potential agricultural land in Illinois? And then you can see we also looked at actually two scenarios, okay? One was like, what if like fertilizer was applied in the fall along with the cover crop, or fertilizer was put in the spring, okay? Your pre-plant and site is kind of 50-50 split, okay? So these are the comparison. Okay, these are simulated result from the model. So you like again, there's a discrepancy in the biomass. Northern part, which is a little colder compared to southern part. So southern part has more biomass compared to northern part. So your biomass range was between 800 in the northern part versus almost 2,400 in kilogram per hectare. Okay, those are the unit that we use, metric unit. And you can see like in terms of biomass, it doesn't really matter. I think you get a little bit more biomass if you apply fertilizer in the fall, because I think that helps cover crop growth, okay? So that was, we first wanted to see like, okay, how much your cover crops biomass you can get in the different part of the state. Like, and most of the time what we did was your cover crop was planted along the same time you do the harvesting. So it was not the before, but around the same time. So next thing we want to look at actually is then what will happen like in terms of your, let's say, nitrate loss and nitrate leaching. Like that means how much nitrate reduction we can reduce, okay? So then what we did was then after we looked at how much cover crop we can grow, so that we can see, you can look at this two figure on the left. These are for the nitrate loss in the tile flow. So what we found out then, like with our model simulation work, we found out actually is that we are able to reduce like around like 30% nitrate in the tile water using the cover crop. And then we looked at actually the other part was like what will happen in then your next cash crop, right? Corn, soybean, okay? What will happen to them, okay? So we saw like, for example, like corn, like and soybean, there might be like, depending on the years, like there might be some years it will be less, some year it will be your high. Like as you can see for corn, like between -1% to sometimes up to 9% benefit. Like for soybean also like -2% to 11%. So okay, so there's a potential, but that's actually the range. But because it depends on the soil type, depends on the region, depends on the rainfall. So we found out it's in the, so some part might have better benefit than other parts, okay? So we have like actually like your, so in terms of yield difference was not that significant. I would not say like there was a major bump in yield for either crops due to the cover crop if that found out, okay? Like long term, like when you look at the long term averages, there were not much of a big difference, okay? So then last story then, to in my presentation is then like what will the then again talking about the big question we're talking about, like how the future outlook looks like, okay? How does things can be different in the future? So for that, what we do is then, so then we have this model set up for the whole state where we run actually the crop model on each 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer grid. That's your around like 3 mile by 3 mile section. And we have like almost 1,000 of those cell in the state, and we run for individual like almost all the cell that is agricultural land, okay? So for this one, then we use some of the output from the climate models from the, we have like 6 climate model. We drive them per 2 scenarios, okay? Like one is your medium emission versus high emission in the future. And then like what we did was then the way the system worked is first we have the output. Then what we did was then we want to make sure if there's some bias in the output, we have to correct that for the future. So we actually did that. And then this is how our a future outlook look like for Illinois in terms of rainfall and temperature in the future, okay? Then from there, then we wanted to look at actually is then cover crop impact, how cover crop will be impacted in future because of the climate change, okay? So we look at 2 scenarios. One was actually, let's say, for the cover crop field, okay, let's say the field which was, let's say we already have cover crop, we looked at how much nutrient loss was there now versus how much nutrient loss can be in future. We also looked at actually those fields without cover crop versus those fields in the future, like again, no cover crop scenario in the past, but say no cover crop in the field. Then we also look at actually the cross comparison. Okay, the field which do not have the cover crop now, but let's say if they adapt cover crop and then but in the future, how does the nutrient loss scenario looks like for them? Okay, so we did like cross comparison. One was your field without cover crop now versus future, field with cover crop now versus future, and then field without cover crop now, but then with cover crop in the future, how does nutrient outlook looks like for the future? Okay, so this is your impact on the grass crop. Okay, what we found out based on our simulation is then the way your future temperature, because we knew like future will be warmer than what we have, and there's a difference in also the rainfall pattern will be different. We found out actually then the two crop that we grow in this region will be impacted differently. Okay, there's a potential actually to reduce your the corn yield in future because of the heat stress. Okay, because of the warming. Okay, so the corn yield is predicted in our simulation decreasing in the all scenario. Okay, by your mid-century. Okay, like we talked about like a 20-year scenario. We looked to first past was your 2001 to 2020. Then we looked at 2021 to 2040, and then 2041 to 2060. Okay, these three scenarios. Okay, so we have your 30s and 50s are your those two scenarios. And then yield was correlated with your corn yield was going down, where the soybean yield for most part was up, except like I think some reason in the southern part might have been a lesser yield as well in Illinois. But then cover crop, like with the warm and with the rainfall pattern changing, cover crop biomass was going up in all the scenarios. Okay, like your near term versus far term future, as well as two emission scenarios that we looked at. Okay, same thing for nitrate, your soil N loss. What will happen to nutrient loss? What we find out as then actually is then there's a potential actually because of your effect. Okay, because of your loss in the yield for the corn, and then your more mineralization due to the warm climate, that can actually lead your nitrate loss can increase like somewhere around like 50%. Okay, like you can see like the red lines means like your for most part you have like high nitrate loss in the future. Okay, and then we looked at actually is then how the if you actually then add your cover crop into your cash crop dynamics, right? If you're not doing cover crop now, but you want to add cover crop into your system, as well as then how does will impact the cash crop yield in the future. Okay, as again we see, even having cover crop does not help in reducing in improving yield any much. Okay, we can see still even if you apply cover crop in the future, you can still see the corn yield gonna go down regardless. Okay, with or without cover crop, because of the warming and because of the changing precipitation pattern, that's gonna happen. Okay, but soybean, that's opposite actually. Because of the warmth, soybean probably going to get some little bit of yield boost. Okay, and then again, when you have cover crop field in the future, how the nitrogen looks like. Okay, nitrogen loss going to increase. Okay, like around like 50-60% again. As you can see, this green region is a potential where you can increase. Some there's a potential to reduce for the leaching part, but then again, if you look at the overall impact, you see more green than red here as well. So that means both leaching and your tile loss gonna increase in future, even with the cover crop. Okay. So then what is the take home message then? Okay. So one thing is first, well, regardless whether you do cover crop or not in the future, because of the change in precipitation pattern and with the increase in temperature, there will be heat on the corn yield. Corn yield will be significantly impacted, somewhere between 10 to 20% reduction in the yield potential reduction. Whereas actually for soybean, there might be a potential to gain some yield, okay, because of the warming. Okay, and then again, increasing temperature would help actually cover crop adaptation, especially because you can get more biomass because of the more mineralization and your more your hotter weather. Okay, and then your cover crop benefit in reducing loss could increase. Okay, so that means cover crop can be more effective. But then when you look at actually climate into that, okay, the increasing cover crop benefit would not be able to mitigate the adverse impact of climate change. Like for example, like because I said like climate change can increase your nitrate loss in the soil from the tile, right? But cover crop will try to bring it down, but then what you see is then that nitrate loading or nitrogen loading in the tile flow with the cover crop in future condition could be higher than the nitrate loading in the current condition when we are not using cover crop in Illinois. Okay, So what that means actually is then cover crop still is effective in reducing the nitrate loss. Okay, as we saw earlier, with current condition, you can get up to 30% reduction. But then when you add compounding effect of your climate change to that, your change in precipitation pattern and your higher temperature in the future, that will actually reduce the effectiveness of cover crop, and then your nitrate loss will probably, cover crop alone may not be able to get that 30% reduction that we see at the moment. Okay, therefore, actually, what we need to do is then probably you have to add some other thing also with the cover crop now, just like other, like say, edge of the field practices. Okay, like things like nutrient management, going from fall to spring, pre-plant and citrus, or like other edge of the field practice, like your saturation buffer, bioreactors, Urchi bioreactors, or drainage water management. Probably we have to actually add like more thing into the dynamics. Like cover crop alone may not be as effective as they are now. Okay. So then, so that's kind of my quick 30-minute spiel on this topic. And sorry about the small glitch that we had. Okay. And then I think it's time for the question. In the meantime, if you are here for your CCU credit one, that's information on the on your screen. Okay. Talk to Elena and she will be able to send you your CEU credit. Okay. With that, I'll be open to, happy to answer any question that you might have.
Sounds good. And yes, feel free to please submit questions in the chat box. I will then relay those to Dr. Bhattarai. A couple questions here to get us started. Could you tell us about, what do you see as the role of cover crop management in terms of those future scenarios that you just showed on that last slide, with nitrogen loading and tile flow potentially increasing big time in the future, even with cover crops? What do you see as best practices for cover crop management?
So what I will say actually is that in terms of cover crop, because we don't know like what things gonna be in 30, 40 years down the road, right? How things gonna likely change, because I think it all depends on what we're doing for the next 20, 30 years, right? Okay. So I know things gonna change. Like, for example, I think we're talking about, let's say, the corn yield, right? Okay, like the corn that we grow now, if we don't do anything, like probably will not get the same yield in the future with a change in the condition, right? But then that will trigger actually is that now knowing that actually, like then the yield gonna be affected, like for soybean is positive, like even if we the same breed. So I think the research gonna dictate, I think, the way in such a way that actually how then we can mitigate those impact, right? How we can actually then change some, let's say, either like make new hybrid that is actually favorable to this warm weather rather than what we are growing at the moment. And the same with the cover crop, probably then we probably think about then what recommendation that we have at the moment, right? For example, a typical, if you look at Midwest Cover Crop Council recommendation, like for example, after corn, you go to cereal rice, a good practice that's before soybean, and then probably after soybean, probably you want to do like hairy veg or radish or some other legume in the mix, right? So then I think, because as we know, like the current practice, like because we actually in this scenario, actually we only looked at the cereal rye. Actually, we will consider other potential cover crops. So that means what this means actually is then for the future, we may have to then find out, like maybe diversify, like in terms of options, like, okay, what are the cover crops that can thrive better in that condition, like with a change in rainfall pattern, with a warmer weather in the winter, like what are the cover crop species that are actually more efficient in those conditions in actually recycling the nutrient rather than what we're using at the moment. Like maybe as I talked about alternatives, right? The way we started with our actually what cereal rye is, because the model didn't have cereal rye, but that's our go-to cover crop in the region. So we actually started from winter wheat to adapt to simulate as a proxy for cereal rye. But then what if, like, since winter wheat actually is a little bit of less winter hardy, right? That means this could die in the colder temperature earlier than the cereal rye would die. Maybe we can shift from maybe, let's say, cereal rye to winter wheat in that condition, because winter wheat can still survive that little bit warmer condition. So I think we see in terms of adaptation would be like switching to like your cover crop, which are more adaptive to that changed future conditions, which is your rainfall pattern, maybe drier winter and or warmer winter. So we're gonna shift in recommendation towards like those different variety or different crops that will be more effective in those conditions.
Sounds good. And a related question along that line is, do you think your results would be significantly different for farmers basically planting mixtures, planting a winter cereal blend, such as rye, wheat, barley, versus just the cereal rye on its own?
Can be a little different actually, because in this case we just stick to one, because that was like our first exercise was actually let's use actually one that is commonly used. Okay, so then the way like each crop is affected by your environmental condition, right? Your soil moisture stress, or your winter temperature, okay, or your, let's say, your other environmental stressors, right? Okay, dry versus wet conditions, your temperatures, each crop behave differently. Okay, so that means when you look at actually when you are using a mix versus just using one species, definitely the effect on the cover crop itself growth, okay, and then how that cover crop recycles your nutrient will be different. So I'm sure like if we are able to simulate like a kind of mix rather than just using the one crop that we use, in this case cereal rye, the result might look a little different than what we are seeing in this case. Yes.
Okay, how about in terms of looking at those yield impacts on the future scenarios? It looks like there were major impacts on corn in particular with that corn yield potential. What are your thoughts in terms of diversifying rotations? Do we need to be thinking about adding in small grains, relay intercropping, other practices, extended rotations, knowing that the corn in particular is going to be majorly impacted?
Definitely, yes. So I think we're gonna slowly adapt to this condition, right? As we are seeing, like again, like we are in the rain-fed system, right? We don't do much irrigation in this region, upper Mississippi, Illinois, Iowa. We don't see much, and then since we rely on Mother Nature, and we have seen that in the past 10, 15 years, like your weather pattern has been less predictive, right? When you have like suddenly a drought year, and then we have burst up 2 and 3 wet years, and then again more is your wet and dry condition happening more frequently than what you used to get in the past, and that those things are already affecting our yield, right? Like 2012, like that's a drought year in the Illinois, and we saw like almost 50% hit in the yield throughout the state. Like rather than getting 200 bushel acre of corn from our field, we got like 110, 120, right? So we have seen that more happening more frequently, and then in terms of your in the future, definitely we need to think about then with the changing pattern of rainfall and changing pattern of the weather, like basically, especially on the temperature side, more warmer, then we think about like what would be the more, let's say, favorable cropping practice in those conditions, right? Like rather than using just like corn like we're using, which may not be that sustainable, I would say. Like, I mean, you can still grow corn, but then probably with the less yield, and probably that's not probably will not make growers happy, right? Because will be getting less money out of that. So maybe diversification can be one option, like talking about using like small grain and other crops that are more favorable or can be grown on that condition better, right? And then or intercropping, like mixing other varieties. And the good thing about actually what we saw in terms of future climate change was then in the winter time will be relatively warmer than what we see, right? Because your warming happens throughout the year, and then so then if it helps to grow cover crop even better in those winter conditions, that means we may see like actually there might be lengthened your cropping season. That means like we can maybe able to even like grow up to November, and then maybe start in March, I think, in that case. So that means we might have a little bit longer cropping season. We may be able to have like squeeze 2 crops in that duration as well. So many things are uncertain, I would say, like at this point, like how things will pull into the future down 30, 40 years, and then how we can adapt to that. I think we'll see slowly, like as we see more impact on the yield, as we see like, okay, how things are been changing, I think there will be gradual progress towards like, okay, what can be better practice in those like changing conditions, right? Changing precipitation pattern and or increase in temperature. What are the crops will be more conducive to those conditions? And I think we will gradually adapt to those slowly to those new practices over the time.
Sounds good. With the cover crops, so I think this was shared in story 1 of your 3 stories.
Yes.
What were the seeding techniques? How are they seeded and when? Can you tell us a little bit about the management of those, just so we have a sense of timing?
Yes, so I think those most of those cover crops were actually at the earlier year were done actually right around the harvest time. So I think it was harvest and seeding was done at the same time. I think most of the time I think the 1 year was is a drilled, and I think 1 year was broadcasted, and I think later year when they realized that actually like, they were not getting good yield, especially like when the winter hits early, I think they did was actually put the cover crop even before corn or soybean harvest. Like, and this went into like sometime in September, early to mid September, and that was done actually broadcasted over a standing corn and soybean plant. So they actually done alternatives as well, and we try to replicate those into our simulation as well. Like, okay, each year when was your cropping practices, like when was cash crop planted, when was harvested, when was your cover crop went in, when was cover crop was killed. We try to replicate exact same time frame as we are trying to simulate the dynamics. So yeah.
All right. Well, if folks have any final questions, go ahead and get those typed into the chat now. And I'll just go over once again the Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit opportunity. So if you watched today's webinar and would like to request a CEU, send that into Alena Whitaker. It's ALENAW at iastate.edu. Send that in today by 5 o'clock, please. And then I'd also invite everyone watching the webinar today to please fill out this voluntary demographic survey. We'd ask you to fill this out, and this is for anyone who's participated in our webinars and any USDA funded programs. You can scan the QR code that's on your screen, or we've also got the web URL there. So that's found at www.iowalearningfarms.org/survey. If you've already filled out the survey earlier this year in 2023 from watching our webinars, then no need to do that again, just once for the calendar year. But if you haven't, we request that you please do that. That would be wonderful. And then next week's webinar, we'll be back here again, same time, same place. Next Wednesday, June 7th, we'll be welcoming Craig Drury. He is a soil biochemist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And we will be talking about maximizing nitrogen availability to crops while minimizing nitrogen loss to the air. So should be another very interesting talk there. It looks like we don't have any additional questions that have come in. So Dr. Bhattarai, any final concluding thoughts from you before we sign off?
Well, we live in a strange future, right? We don't know like how things gonna fall in the future. So I think what we do is like, I think it's I think it's a learning exercise, right? We're gonna learn how things gonna look like tomorrow and the next year and the following year, and then we try to find out the solution for those problems. So I think it's a learning experience, not for the farmers, for us researchers as well, like how things gonna be different in the future, and then how we can come up with the solutions to those unique problems that we may come across in the future. Yeah.
Excellent. Well said. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time today. And thank you everyone for tuning into our webinar. We'll see you next Wednesday, June 7th at noon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah.